Hey, a man in East Tennessee says his flashlight was still in his hand when he saw its beam blinking from inside the tree line. Same flicker, same weak battery stutter. His was on, steady, gripped tight in his fist, and somehow there was a second one 30 yards out, doing exactly what his was doing a half-second behind. He was camping alone off a Forest Service road after a bad breakup, 2 bars of signal, a dog tied near the fire. He made it out by morning. He hasn't camped alone since, and he won't say which road it was. It started 3 nights earlier, when he only wanted somewhere quiet to think. His name doesn't matter for this. He asked that it not be used, and the details around the road have been changed enough that you couldn't find it even if you tried, which people have. What matters is that he wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't the type. He'd tell you that himself if you asked, probably with a little irritation, like the fact that something happened to him at all was an insult to how ordinary he'd tried to be that week. He'd been through a bad stretch, the kind where you don't want to talk to anybody, but you also don't want to be in your apartment listening to the silence where another person used to be. So he loaded up his truck on a Thursday afternoon, threw in a tent that hadn't been used since college, a cooler, some firewood he probably didn't need since there'd be plenty out there, and his dog, a mutt named Scout who'd ridden in the truck bed his whole life and never once needed convincing. The spur road was one he'd found on a map app 2 years earlier and always meant to try. Gravel, narrow, climbing steadily up through hardwoods that hadn't been logged in a long time judging by their size. The kind of road that has a name on paper, but nobody local bothers to use it. 2 bars of signal at the trailhead. 1 bar a quarter mile in. Nothing after that, which he expected and honestly wanted. He stopped at a gas station near the base of the mountain to fill up and grab coffee that had clearly been sitting on the burner since morning. The clerk, an older guy with a Carhartt jacket and forearms like rope, rang him up without much conversation until he mentioned where he was headed. Then the guy paused. "You going up past the second creek crossing?" He said maybe, depending on how far he wanted to push it. "Don't camp past there alone if you can help it. Dog'll tell you before you know, so you listen to him if he gets funny about something." It was the kind of thing you hear in gas stations all over Appalachia. Half warning, half local color, delivered the way you'd tell someone to watch for deer at dusk. He said thanks, meant it politely, and didn't think about it again until he needed to. The campsite he picked was about 2 miles past that second crossing, a flat clearing above a thin creek with an old fire ring someone had built out of creek stone years back. No other vehicles on the road the whole way up. No other fire smoke in the air, just trees and gravel, and the particular quiet that isn't silence so much as the absence of anything human. He did what you do. Unloaded the truck, pitched the tent while there was still light, working out the stakes on ground that wasn't quite level. Gathered wood, though there was already a decent stack someone had left stacked and dry under a lean-to of bark, which he was grateful for and didn't think twice about. Got the fire going before dusk, because you always want the fire going before dusk. Boiled water in a dented pot for the gas station coffee, which tasted like it had been fighting for its life the whole drive up, but was better hot than cold. Checked his phone. 2 bars, then 1, then a little circle that spun and gave up. Scout sniffed around the site the way he always did, marking the usual spots, flopping down near the fire with his chin on his paws. Ordinary dog behavior. Nothing about that first hour felt like anything except what it was supposed to be. A quiet night, alone, exactly what he'd driven up there for. It was maybe an hour after a full dark, fire burned down to a good bed of coals when he saw it the first time. A flicker, deep in the tree line across the creek. White light, weak, on in a stutter that looked almost mechanical. His first thought was another camper. Somebody down the spur he hadn't seen a truck for, walking with a flashlight that had seen better days. He almost called out, the way you do when you want to be neighborly and also want the other person to know you've clocked them. But something made him hold off. Maybe just tiredness. Maybe the fact that the light didn't move the way a person walking with a flashlight moves, didn't swing, didn't bob, didn't advance or retreat. It just flickered in place, 30, 40 yards out, past the creek, and then it was gone. He told himself it was reflected light. Wet leaves catching something. Maybe a star through a gap in the canopy. Maybe his own eyes playing tricks after staring into a fire too long. That's the kind of thing your brain does at night in the woods. Fills gaps with familiar shapes because unfamiliar ones are harder to sit with. He fed the fire another log, mostly for the sound of it, and told Scout to lie back down when the dog lifted his head toward the creek. It happened again about 20 minutes later. Same spot, near as he could tell. Same stutter, 3 quick flickers, a pause, 2 more, a longer pause, then nothing. And that was the detail that would stay with him longer than anything else that trip, longer than what came the second night, longer than the footprints. Because his own flashlight, the cheap aluminum one he'd bought at a hardware store 2 winters back, did that exact same thing. 3 quick, pause, 2 more, longer pause. It was a dying battery pattern, specific to that particular unit, the kind of thing you'd only recognize if you owned the light yourself and had watched it die in your hand more than once. His flashlight was zipped in his tent. Off. He hadn't touched it since he packed it. He sat very still by the fire for a long time after that, telling himself there had to be an explanation, that flashlights probably failed in predictable ways, that lots of cheap batteries stutter the same because they're built the same, mass-produced in the same factory, wired the same way. It was a reasonable thought. It didn't make him feel any better. He didn't sleep well that first night, though nothing else happened. He lay in the tent listening to the creak and the occasional pop of the dying fire. Scout curled against his side instead of at his feet like usual, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he finally drifted off, telling himself that tomorrow, in daylight, all of this would look exactly as small and explainable as it should. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't even close. Morning came in gray and slow, fog sitting low over the creek the way it does in that part of the mountains most mornings, burning off by 9 or so. He walked down to the water first thing, coffee in hand, and looked across at the spot where the light had been. Just trees. Regular hardwoods, leaf litter, nothing out of place. No tracks in the mud along the bank that he could see, though the ground there was rocky and dry enough that tracks wouldn't necessarily show. He almost packed up right then. Almost. But daylight has a way of shrinking things down to size, and by the time he'd had a second cup of that terrible coffee and let Scout run around the clearing chasing whatever smell had caught his attention, the whole thing had settled into something closer to an odd story he'd tell people later than an actual reason to leave. He liked the sight. He liked the quiet. He told himself he'd stay one more night and then head back Saturday morning like he'd planned. That decision is the kind of thing he'd go back over 100 times afterward, turning it in his mind, wondering what would have happened if he'd just loaded the truck that morning instead. He never landed anywhere useful with it. You can't undo a decision by thinking about it hard enough, no matter how many times you try. The second day passed easy enough. He hiked up along an old logging grade for a couple hours, Scout ranging ahead and circling back the way dogs do, and came back to camp in the early afternoon feeling better than he had in weeks. He told himself that was the whole point of the trip, and for a few hours, it actually worked. He got the fire going earlier the second night, wanting more daylight around him before dark fully settled in, though he wouldn't have admitted that was the reason if you'd asked him directly. It was full dark, past 9, when Scout stopped moving. Not growling, not barking, just stopped, mid-motion. One paw lifted, nose pointed toward the creek, utterly still in a way that dog had never been still before in his life. He was a nervous, twitchy animal normally, the kind that flinched at falling acorns. This was different. This was a kind of stillness that looked almost deliberate, like the dog understood something about staying quiet that the man didn't yet. He didn't hear anything himself for a while. Just the fire, the creek, the ordinary layered hum of night woods. Then, faint from somewhere past the tree line, footsteps. Slow ones. Not an animal's gait, not the quick scatter of a deer, or the low waddle of a raccoon working through leaves. Even spaced steps, like someone walking carefully, deliberately, over uneven ground. He told himself it was another camper again. Said it out loud, actually, mostly for Scout's benefit, though the dog didn't so much as twitch an ear at the sound of his voice. The footsteps continued for maybe 30 seconds and stopped. He held his breath without meaning to. It's a strange thing to notice yourself doing, holding your breath in the woods at night, listening so hard your ears start to ring with the effort. He held it for maybe 5 seconds before he made himself let it out, slow, quiet as he could. The footsteps started again the instant he exhaled. He would tell people later that this was the moment he understood something was actually wrong. Not later, not after the flashlight or the boot prints, but right there, sitting by his fire, realizing that whatever was out there had been waiting for the sound of his own breath to move again. He didn't sleep in the tent that second half of the night without every light he had on inside it, which did nothing for the dark outside but made him feel marginally less like something could see him without him seeing it back. Scout lay pressed against his ribs the whole night, rigid, silent, refusing every attempt to get him to settle down and sleep normally. Around 2 in the morning, something said his name, not shouted, not close. It came from somewhere past the creek, low and flat, and it took him a long moment lying there frozen to be sure he'd actually heard it and not imagined it out of pure, exhausted fear. But he had heard it, once, clear enough that there was no explaining it away as wind moving through the leaves, no explaining it away at all. He didn't answer. He would say later that not answering was the only decision that whole trip he was completely sure had been the right one. He lay there until the sky started going gray, not sleeping, barely breathing, one hand resting on Scout's back the whole time, feeling the dog's heart going too fast against his palm. When he finally unzipped the tent at first light, the fire was dead, just cold ash and blackened wood, and the truck sat where he'd left it. And for one long relieved moment, everything looked exactly as ordinary as he needed it to look. Then he tried the flashlight. It was the same one from the first night, still zipped into the tent's gear pocket the whole time, untouched, never turned on. The battery was completely dead, not low, dead, the kind of dead that takes hours of continuous use, not 2 nights sitting unused in a canvas pocket. He stood there a long moment holding it, turning it over in his hands, before he made himself look at the ground around the tent. There were footprints in the soft dirt just past the fire ring. Boot-shaped, deep, the kind that come from someone's actual weight pressing into damp ground. They circled the tent in a loose, uneven ring, 6 or 7 of them that he could count clearly, and every single one of them faced inward, toward the tent, toward where he'd been lying all night with his hand on his dog's back. None of them faced away, not one print leading back toward the creek or the woods or anywhere at all. Just a ring of prints facing in, like whoever made them had simply stood there all night, all the way around him, and never once turned to leave. He packed the truck faster than he'd ever packed anything in his life, hands shaking in a way he blamed on the cold, even though it wasn't that cold. The truck started clean, no trouble at all, despite how certain he'd felt the night before that it would somehow fail him when he needed it most. Scout was in the passenger seat before the tailgate was even latched. He didn't look back at the tree line once on the drive out, though he'd tell you later that not looking took more effort than anything else about that morning. He recharged the flashlight that night at a motel 2 towns over, plugged into the wall beside the bed, and it worked exactly as it should once the battery came back. No different from before. No explanation for where 2 full nights of charge had gone. He kept it after that. Still has it, as far as anyone knows. He never camped alone again, and he keeps a spare battery pack in his glove box now, for no reason he's ever been able to explain when people ask him why. The next account comes from a woman who took a shortcut through Kentucky backroads to save 40 minutes on a drive home. She never found out what it cost her. Hello. A woman driving a Kentucky backroad at night says she passed the same barefoot man standing on 3 different curves of the same mountain road, each time further ahead than her car should have let him get. No side roads, no way around her. Just the same man, still, watching the headlights pass, appearing again a half-mile up before she'd even caught her breath from the last one. She was taking a shortcut to save 40 minutes on a drive home from a family visit. Storm coming in fast, GPS gone the moment the trees closed overhead. She made it home. She has never driven that road again. She'd left her mother's place later than she meant to, the way you always do when a visit runs long and nobody wants to be the one who ends it. It was already dark by the time she hit the state highway, and the weather app on her phone had been muttering about a storm system moving through most of the afternoon. The kind of warning she'd half tuned out because Kentucky gets storm warnings the way other places get pollen counts. Her regular route home ran another 40 minutes past a stretch of interstate that tended to flood in heavy rain. And with the storm closing in, she remembered something her cousin had mentioned once offhand about an old 2-lane that cut through the hills and saved real time if you didn't mind the turns. She hadn't taken it before. She had the general shape of it in her head from her cousin's directions and figured her phone would fill in the rest. It didn't. The GPS held a signal for the first 10 minutes, guiding her off the highway and onto a narrower road that climbed steadily into hill country, trees crowding closer on both sides the further she went. Then the blue dot froze. The little spinning circle appeared, and it never came back. She wasn't overly worried. Her cousin's directions were simple enough. Stay on the 2-lane, cross the bridge, watch for the turn after that. And she had almost a full tank of gas and a working set of headlights, which felt, in that moment, like enough. She stopped for gas about 20 minutes before she lost signal. A lonely station with 2 pumps and a bell over the door that jingled when she walked in. The woman behind the counter, older, with the kind of tired patient face that comes from decades of night shifts, rang up her gas and a coffee without much conversation until she mentioned where she was headed. That old 2-lane past the ridge? The woman's hand slowed on the register. There's a bridge on it, 1 lane, bad curve right before. Don't flash your lights at anyone standing near it. Just don't. She laughed a little, more out of surprise than humor, and asked why not. The waitress just shook her head and told her the total, and didn't say anything else about it. It was the kind of warning that sounds like small-town color, the sort of thing you get told in gas stations all over Appalachia and mostly forget about by the next exit. She thanked her, took her coffee, and drove on. The rain started about 10 minutes later, light at first, just enough to need the wipers on their slowest setting. tapping against the windshield in a rhythm that would have been almost soothing if the road hadn't kept narrowing the further she went. No shoulder to speak of, trees close enough on both sides that her headlights barely cleared the canopy overhead when the road dipped into low spots. She saw the first figure about 20 minutes past the gas station, standing at the tree line just before a sharp curve, motionless, barefoot even in the cold rain, watching her headlights approach. Her first thought was a stranded motorist, somebody who'd broken down or wandered off a property nearby, and she slowed instinctively, some part of her already rehearsing whether to stop and ask if he needed help. But the rain was picking up, and something about the way he stood, too still, arms at his sides, not waving, not moving toward the road at all, made her decide against it. She told herself he probably lived close by, that people walk these roads at all hours out here, that it wasn't her business or her problem. She kept driving, watching him shrink in her mirror until the curve swallowed him from view. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The second curve came almost a mile further on, and there he was again. Same stance, same posture. Barefoot on wet gravel in weather that would have most people limping with cold within minutes. She actually slowed the car to a near stop that time, staring, trying to make her mind produce some explanation that made sense. A twin, a coincidence, some trick of rain and headlights turning an ordinary tree stump into a human shape twice in a row. Nothing fit. There was no side road connecting the two curves. No way, on foot, in the time she'd been driving, for the same person to have gotten from the first spot to the second. That should have been impossible. She kept driving instead of thinking about why. The dashboard clock read 11:40 when she rounded the third curve and saw him a final time, closer to the road than either previous sighting, close enough that her headlights caught his face for half a second before she was past him. She would say later she couldn't describe his features with any confidence, only that something about his expression, or the lack of one, had stayed with her longer than anything else about that drive. Not angry, not threatening, just watching, the way you'd watch something pass that you already knew was going to come back around. Ahead, through the rain-streaked windshield, she saw the bridge the waitress had warned her about. Narrow, one lane, guardrails rusted thin, a sharp bend leading right into it exactly as described. And standing at the near end of the bridge, in the full beam of her headlights, was the same man. Her hand went to the high beam switch out of pure reflex, the automatic instinct to flash your lights at anyone standing in a road at night. She had it half pressed before the waitress's voice cut through the panic in her head, clear as if the woman were sitting in the passenger seat. Don't flash your lights at anyone standing near that bridge. Just don't. She let go of the switch. Her hands were shaking on the wheel hard enough that she had to grip it tighter to keep the car steady on the wet asphalt. The problem was not what she saw next. It was what she didn't. She never slowed down. That was the one clear decision she made in the whole stretch of road. The one thing she'd tell people afterward she was certain had been right. Don't stop. Don't flash the lights. Don't give whatever was standing there any reason to think she'd noticed more than she had. She kept her foot steady on the gas, eyes fixed just past the hood of the car, and drove straight toward the bridge like the man wasn't there at all. He wasn't there when she reached it. That was almost worse. The near end of the bridge, where he'd been standing clear as anything in her headlights 10 seconds earlier, was empty. Just wet railing and rushing black water beneath, visible for the half second her headlights swept across the gap in the guardrail. She crossed the bridge at a crawl, tires thudding over loose boards, the whole structure narrow enough that she found herself holding her breath again without meaning to. The same way she had 100 times as a kid crossing bridges in the dark, except this time the fear wasn't imaginary. She made it across. The road on the other side climbed again, curving hard to the left before straightening out into what she hoped was the final stretch before her cousin's promised turn. Her hands ached from gripping the wheel. The rain had gotten heavier, drumming against the roof loud enough that she almost didn't hear it. A soft shifting sound, gravel moving, coming from right beside the car, keeping pace with her, though there was no shoulder on that stretch wide enough for anything to be walking alongside her at all. She didn't look. She'd already decided, somewhere back at the bridge, that she wasn't going to look at anything else that road wanted to show her. The low point came about a half-mile past the second curve, a dip where runoff had pooled across the asphalt in a wide, dark sheet that her headlights barely revealed until she was already easing into it. Water sprayed up around the wheel wells, and for 1/6 second the car seemed to hesitate, tires losing purchase just slightly on the flooded surface, before catching again and pulling through. Her phone sat dead in the cup holder. No bars, no signal. Screen dark except for the useless frozen GPS circle still spinning from 20 minutes back. If the car had stalled there, in that water, in that dark, she wouldn't have had a single way to call anyone. It didn't stall. She got through the low point and kept climbing, and somewhere in the relief of that, without thinking, without remembering the rule she'd been so careful to follow the whole rest of the drive, she glanced up at the rearview mirror. The shoulder behind her, back near the flooded dip, was empty. That much, at least, looked right. But ahead, not behind, ahead, through the windshield, in the exact spot her headlights were about to sweep across on the upcoming curve, the same man was standing again. Facing the wrong direction this time. Not watching the road, not watching her car approach the way he had every time before. Facing away, toward the trees, as if he'd been standing there long before she'd ever come around that bend, waiting for something that had nothing to do with her at all. She didn't slow down, she didn't flash her lights. She drove straight past him, close enough that her side mirror nearly clipped the edge of the road, and refused, with everything she had left in her, to look in the rearview mirror again. The turn her cousin had described came up faster than she expected after that. A narrow gravel spur breaking off to the right, marked by nothing more than a bent reflector post half swallowed in kudzu. She took it without slowing, gravel spitting under the tires, and didn't fully let out the breath she'd been holding until she saw the glow of a real highway sign up ahead, headlights of other cars passing steady and ordinary in the rain. She got home a little after 1 in the morning. Her hands were still shaking when she carried her bag inside. It wasn't until the next morning, cleaning mud out of the car before work, that she found it, a single footprint on the driver's side floor mat. Bare, muddy, small enough to have come from someone walking without shoes on wet ground, pointed toward the driver's seat as though whoever left it had been standing right where her own foot rested the entire drive. She scrubbed it out before she let herself think too hard about it. She never told her mother which road she'd taken, and she never took it again. Not even weeks later when a work trip would have saved her nearly the same 40 minutes on the way back. She drove the long way, the safe way, the interstate way, even though it flooded sometimes and cost her the better part of an hour. And she has never, not once since that night, used her high beams on anyone standing along the side of a road, no matter how much they might look like they need help. Another story, this one from a couple renting a cabin near an old logging road, follows the same pattern in a quieter way. Listen. A couple renting a remote cabin for their anniversary say they heard something breathing beneath the floorboards on their very first night. Slow and even, the kind of rhythm no pipe or heater makes on its own. It paused exactly when they stopped talking, like it was listening back. They were 3 miles from cell signal, in a cabin the owner swore was just old and drafty. They left before their reservation was up. Weeks later, the listing online no longer showed the room they'd slept closest to. They only found that out by accident, scrolling one night, unable to stop thinking about the door that wouldn't quite close. They'd booked the place almost a year in advance, the way people do when they want a specific weekend to mean something. 5 years married, both of them working enough hours that a quiet cabin with no Wi-Fi and a wood stove had sounded less like a compromise and more like exactly what they needed. The listing photos showed a squat, sturdy structure tucked into hardwoods off an old logging road. A covered porch, a stone chimney, the kind of rustic charm that photographs well and asks you to overlook a few creaks in exchange. The drive-in took longer than the map suggested, the gravel road narrowing steadily until it was barely wide enough for one vehicle, roots and washouts slowing them to a crawl for the last mile. Cell signal dropped to nothing about 2 miles out. They'd expected that mostly. The listing had mentioned it, almost as a selling point. True isolation, it said, no distractions. The owner met them at the cabin himself, a heavy-set man in his 60s with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who'd lived his whole life on that mountain. He walked them through quickly: wood stove, propane heater for backup, well water, a hand pump if the electric ever cut out. He pointed to a closed door at the back of the main room, off the kitchen. Back room's just storage. Door sticks some. Don't force it, it'll come open fine on its own eventually. He said it the way you'd mention a loose stair tread, offhand, already moving toward his truck. They didn't think anything of it. Old cabins have doors that stick. That's part of the charm you pay for. That first evening went exactly the way they'd pictured it. They unpacked groceries into a small propane fridge, got the wood stove going with kindling from a stack by the door, and sat on the porch with wine, watching the light fail over the ridgeline across the hollow. The guest book on the kitchen counter was full of the usual warm, generic entries. Great views, so peaceful, will definitely be back. Except for one page near the middle that had been torn out cleanly, leaving just a thin strip of paper still glued into the binding. Neither of them thought much of it at the time. Guest books get damaged. People tear out pages for all kinds of ordinary reasons. They went to bed early, tired from the drive, lamp oil smell still hanging faint in the air from the lantern they'd used to read by before switching it off. The propane heater ticked steadily somewhere in the front room, a familiar comforting sound, the kind that makes an old building feel occupied and alive rather than empty. It was maybe an hour after they'd turned off the light when the husband noticed it first. A low hum beneath the floor, steady, rhythmic. He mentioned it to his wife in the dark, half joking, guessing it was the propane line running somewhere under the cabin, or maybe a mouse working through the crawlspace insulation. She agreed it was probably nothing, and for a while, lying there in the dark, that explanation held up fine. The hum had a shape to it, though, that neither of them wanted to say out loud at first. Not mechanical, not the kind of hum a pipe or a line makes. It rose and fell in a pattern that sounded, the longer they listened, uncomfortably close to breathing. Slow, even in and out, the kind of rhythm a sleeping person makes. Except it was coming from directly beneath the floorboards of a cabin with no basement, only a crawl space too shallow, by any account, for someone to lie down inside. They talked quietly for a while, working through the possibilities out loud the way people do when they want the sound of their own voices to push a little bit of fear back. An animal denning under the floor. Some quirk of the propane system they'd never encountered before. The husband even got up once, walked to the kitchen, and pressed his palm flat against the cold floorboards near where the sound seemed loudest, feeling for vibration. He didn't feel anything, but the sound was there, unmistakable, the moment he went still and listened. It was his wife who noticed the pattern first. She'd been talking, something about their plans for the next day, and stopped mid-sentence to listen for a moment. And the sound beneath the floor stopped with her. Not faded. Stopped cleanly in the same breath she'd taken hers. She started talking again, testing it, and the breathing beneath the floor picked back up almost immediately, matching her rhythm now instead of its own. Old cabins make noise. That part was normal, the timing was not. Neither of them slept well that first night, though nothing else happened before morning. They lay there long after the conversation died down entirely, both of them straining in the dark to hear whether the sound would continue without either of them speaking, and it did, slower now, quieter, but still there, still even, still patient in a way that made the word breathing feel less like an exaggeration and more like the only honest word for it. By the time gray light came through the curtains, they were both awake, and neither of them mentioned canceling the trip, though they'd both separately thought about it. They told themselves the daylight would help, and for a while it did. The husband made coffee on the propane stove while his wife opened the curtains and let real morning light spill across the front room. And the sound from the night before already felt smaller, more like something they'd overreacted to out of sheer unfamiliarity with an old building settling around them. They spent the morning hiking a short loop trail the owner had marked on a hand-drawn map tacked near the door. Came back with an appetite, made lunch, and by early afternoon the whole first night had shrunk down into the kind of story they figured they'd tell friends later. Half serious, half laughing. It was while exploring the property behind the cabin that the husband found the crawlspace access panel, a low, square hatch set into the foundation near the back corner. Painted over so many times the seams had nearly disappeared into the surrounding stone. He crouched, ran a hand along the edge, and found it wouldn't budge. Painted shut, sealed tight, the kind of thing that hadn't been opened in years, maybe longer. He mentioned it to his wife mostly as a curiosity. Neither of them tried to force it. It was later that afternoon, walking back around toward the back of the cabin to check the propane tank level, that she noticed the window. The back bedroom, the one with the door the owner had called storage, the one that stuck, had a single small window on its exterior wall, thick with years of dust and grime, half obscured by an overgrown holly bush pressed close against the glass. There was a handprint on the inside of it. She stood there a long moment, certain at first she was misreading a smear, a water stain, some trick of the dust catching afternoon light at the wrong angle. But it wasn't. It was a handprint, clear enough in its outline that she could make out individual fingers pressed against the glass from the inside of a room the owner had told them was just storage. A room they hadn't entered, a room whose door, when she went back around to check, was still closed exactly as it had been the day before. Except it wasn't quite closed. She noticed that second, standing in the kitchen looking at it properly for the first time since they'd unpacked. The door sat ajar by less than an inch, a thin dark gap along its edge, and on the sill just inside that gap, fresh dust had been disturbed, not tracked in from the room, but pushed outward, toward them, toward the kitchen, as if something on the far side of the door had leaned against it recently enough to leave a mark. They called the owner that afternoon, using the one spot near the mailbox down by the road where a single bar of signal sometimes held. He answered on the second ring, and when they described the door, the dust, the handprint on the window, there was a pause on the line long enough that the husband asked if he was still there. "Dr. Sticks," the owner said again, more clipped than before, less patient. "Don't force it." And then, before either of them could ask a follow-up question, before they could mention the window at all, the call cut off, whether from the thin signal or from the owner hanging up, neither of them could say for certain, and calling back only produced 3 rings and silence. The rain started that evening, the way mountain weather does, rolling in fast without much warning, turning the gravel turnout in front of the cabin into a shallow running channel within an hour. The generator out back, their backup if the cabin's aging electric ever failed, sputtered twice when the husband tried starting it just to be safe, catching on the 3rd pull but running rough, coughing every so often like it wasn't fully convinced it wanted to keep going. There was no cell signal at all now, even down by the mailbox. No neighbor's porch light visible from any window, nothing but trees and rain and the sound of water finding new paths down the mountain. They ate dinner quieter than the night before, both of them listening without quite admitting they were listening, and when the breathing started again beneath the floor sometime after dark, it took less time than either of them expected before it wasn't beneath the floor anymore. It had moved. By the second night, the breathing wasn't under the floorboards. It was behind the wall they were leaning against, the wall shared with the back bedroom, close enough now that they could feel something in the rhythm of it through the wood itself if they pressed their palms flat and stayed still. Neither of them wanted to say that out loud. The wife was the one who finally did, quietly, and once it was said there was no unsaying it. They didn't sleep on the couch that night out of comfort. They dragged a kitchen chair over and wedged it under the back bedroom door handle, the kind of thing that wouldn't have stopped anyone determined to get through, but felt, in that moment, like the only thing they had. They sat together near the wood stove instead of going back to the bedroom at all, listening to rain hammer the tin roof, listening to the slow, even breathing on the other side of the wall. Rise and fall, patient as anything they'd ever heard, and waited for whatever came next. They didn't talk much after midnight. That was the wife's idea, actually, a quiet suggestion, almost embarrassed, that maybe the thing on the other side of the wall was listening for their voices, the way it seemed to be listening for their breathing, and that maybe the safest thing they could do was simply stop giving it anything to answer. It worked, in a way that unsettled her more than silence would have. Somewhere past 1 in the morning, in a moment neither of them planned, she matched her breathing deliberately to the rhythm on the other side of the wall, in when it breathed in, out when it breathed out, testing something she couldn't quite name even to herself. The breathing stopped instantly, not faded, not trailed off. Stopped, the way a held breath stops, mid-motion, like something had noticed itself being copied and didn't care for it. It didn't start again that night. That should have felt like relief. It didn't. They stayed by the stove until the sky started to lighten, neither of them sleeping more than a few stretches of exhausted half-consciousness, and by the time real morning light filled the front room, they'd already made the decision without needing to say it aloud to each other. They were leaving. Reservation or no reservation, deposit or no deposit, they were packing the car and getting off that mountain before another night came. Packing took longer than it should have, both of them moving carefully, quietly, as if the cabin itself might notice them preparing to go and object somehow. The husband carried bags out to the car while his wife did a last sweep of the front room, checking under furniture for anything left behind, and it was while she was folding the last blanket that she heard it behind her. The back bedroom door, swinging fully open on its own. No wind to explain it. No draft strong enough in that stagnant, humid morning air to move a door on old hinges that far. She didn't scream. She'd tell people later that surprised her more than almost anything else about the whole trip. How quiet her own reaction was. How her body seemed to understand before her mind did that the smartest thing to do was not react at all. The room beyond the open door was empty. Bare wood floor, a single dusty window with the holly bush pressed against the outside glass. No furniture, Nothing that looked like storage of any kind despite what the owner had told them. And in the far corner, low to the floor, she saw a second panel. Small, square, painted the same color as the wall around it, with a simple hook latch holding it shut. Another door, smaller than the first, built into the room itself, leading somewhere she had no intention of finding out. She called the husband's name once, quiet and controlled, and he came in from the porch fast enough that she knew her voice had carried more fear in it than she'd meant to let through. They stood together in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking into that empty back room, that second locked panel in the corner, neither of them saying anything. It was the husband who remembered the phone charger. It was still plugged into an outlet just inside the back bedroom door, forgotten in the rush of the morning before, and for one instant he actually took a step toward retrieving it. Some ordinary domestic instinct kicking in that said you don't just leave things behind, that's wasteful. That's a $20 charger you'll need again. His wife caught his arm before he'd taken a second step. She didn't say anything elaborate, just his name, low, and a shake of her head. And something in her face made the charger feel, suddenly and completely, like the least important object either of them had ever owned. They left it. They got in the car, and the husband backed carefully down the flooded gravel turnout with the headlights off, easing along by memory and the gray, early light alone, until the cabin's roof line had dropped out of sight behind the trees. And only then did he switch the headlights on, as if some part of him understood without being told that driving away lit up and visible would have meant something different than leaving quietly, unnoticed, in the dark. They didn't speak again until they hit pavement, real pavement, with a road sign and a speed limit and eventually one bar of signal that slowly climbed back to 3. They never went back for the charger. They never went back at all. The husband tried calling the owner once more, weeks later, mostly to settle something in his own mind rather than out of any real desire to understand. And the man's voice on the phone was shorter than either of their previous calls, almost rehearsed, saying only that the cabin had been taken off the market for renovations. And no, he couldn't say for how long. And no, he didn't have time to answer questions about a crawlspace or a back room or anything else. And then the call ended the way it had before, too quickly to have been entirely the fault of a bad connection. It was the wife who found it, months later, scrolling through the rental site out of habit more than intention, unable to fully stop thinking about that trip, even after the horror of it had dulled into something closer to a bad memory than an open wound. The listing was still there, same cabin, same stone chimney, same porch, but the floor plan had changed. The back bedroom simply wasn't in it anymore. Not marked as under renovation, not blocked off, just absent, as though it had never existed in the layout at all. 3 bedrooms quietly become 2, and nothing in any of the new photos so much as hinted that a 4th wall, another door, another room, had ever been there to lose. They still don't book anywhere without asking to see every room first now, no matter how good the reviews are, no matter how far in advance they've paid the deposit. And neither of them has ever, since that weekend, been able to sit quietly in an old house without listening, just a little, for something underneath the floor. The next story comes from a park ranger who worked a trail closure outside a small mountain town, and who still keeps a specific radio frequency written on a card in his wallet. Hey, a park ranger in West Virginia, says he heard a distress whistle from a canyon section of trail that had been closed for 3 weeks. The exact pattern he'd trained 100 hikers to use, 3 short and 1 long, coming from ground nobody could have survived a night on. Dispatch called him off a radio unit that had been decommissioned 2 years earlier. He still has the trail log from that shift. There's a 2-minute gap in it that nobody at the station will explain. He transferred districts the following spring. He still keeps that frequency written on a card in his wallet, though he's never said exactly why. He'd been with the Forest Service almost 9 years by then, long enough to have stopped being spooked by the ordinary strangeness of the job. The sounds animals make at night that sound uncomfortably human. The way fog moves through a hollow like it's got somewhere to be. The eerie stillness that settles over a closed section of trail once the hikers have all gone home. None of that rattled him anymore. That's part of why what happened stuck with him the way it did. He wasn't the type to spook easy, and he'd be the first to tell you that. The storm had come through 4 days earlier, dumping enough rain to wash out a footbridge on one of the district's more remote loops and take down a stretch of trail along a steep canyon section that had already been marginal before the water got to it. Standard procedure: close the section, post the gates, assess the damage, clear anything unstable before reopening. He'd drawn the assessment shift that Tuesday, driving out before dawn to beat the worst of the day's heat. Radio checked, thermos full of coffee that had been sitting in the station pot since the shift before his. The gate at the trailhead was chained and locked exactly as it should be. Closure signage zip-tied to the fence in 3 places, just in case someone tried to argue they hadn't seen it. He logged the condition, radioed dispatch a routine check-in, and started working his way down the trail on foot, noting washouts, downed limbs, spots where the footing had gone soft and unreliable in the storm's aftermath. Ordinary work, the kind you do 100 times a season without a second thought. It was maybe 40 minutes in, working his way along a stretch that ran above the canyon's rim, when he heard the whistle. 3 short blasts, a pause, 1 long. He knew that pattern the way you know your own name. It was the exact distress signal taught in every wilderness safety course he'd ever run. The one he'd personally demonstrated to search and rescue volunteers more times than he could count. It came from somewhere down in the canyon itself, from the closed section, from ground that had been unstable enough 4 days earlier to justify shutting the whole trail down in the first place. His first thought was straightforward and mildly irritated. Somebody had ignored the closure, gotten themselves in trouble down in that canyon, and now he was going to have to deal with an extraction on ground he'd specifically flagged as dangerous. He checked his radio log against dispatch, confirmed no permits had been issued for that section since the closure went into effect, and started making his way toward the rim, already running through the extraction protocol in his head. The whistle repeated a few minutes later. Same pattern, exact same spacing between blasts, and it was the spacing that first snagged something uneasy in the back of his mind. Distress. Whistling, in his experience, was rarely that precise. Panicked people blow whistles in ragged bursts, too fast or too slow, adrenaline scrambling their timing even when they know the pattern cold. This was metronomic. Exactly 2 minutes between each full sequence, the same interval search teams are trained to use when signaling their own position during a coordinated search, a detail that isn't common knowledge outside people who've actually worked search and rescue. He'd trained people to whistle that pattern. He'd never taught it to a stranger. He radioed dispatch to update his position and request the coordinates be logged in case an extraction was needed. Standard practice. Nothing unusual about the call itself. What came back over the radio a moment later was not standard at all. Copy. Be advised, we've also got a call in on Unit 6 requesting your position. He stood there on the trail a long moment before responding, coffee forgotten in his free hand, going cold. Unit 6 had been retired from the district's radio rotation 2 years earlier, decommissioned along with a batch of outdated equipment during an infrastructure upgrade that had replaced half the station's gear. He knew that because he'd been the one who'd helped box up the old units for disposal. There was no possible way for a call to be coming in on that frequency. There was no equipment left in the district capable of transmitting on it. He asked dispatch to repeat the unit number. They did, without hesitation, without any sense that anything about the request was strange to them, which was somehow worse than if they'd sounded confused. The senior ranger's words from a handoff shift months earlier surfaced in his mind with an unpleasant clarity. If dispatch calls you off Unit 6, don't answer. That frequency's retired. He'd taken it at the time as an old-timer's superstition, the kind of half-joking warning experienced staff sometimes pass down about equipment glitches or radio ghosts, the sort of workplace folklore every job accumulates eventually. It hadn't sounded like an instruction he'd ever actually need to follow. Down in the canyon, the whistle sounded again. Closer now, or seeming closer, though he hadn't moved from his position on the rim trail. He didn't answer the radio call. He told dispatch calmly that he was proceeding to visually assess the canyon section and would report back, and he clipped the radio back to his belt without acknowledging Unit 6 at all, though something about the silence that followed on the other end of the line felt, to him, like it had noticed. The trail down toward the canyon rim had been reinforced with switchbacks years earlier, but the storm had chewed through most of the outer edge, leaving a narrow, uncertain path along ground that shifted underfoot in a way that made him move slower than he wanted to. He kept the whistle sound in his ears the whole way down, tracking it, trying to fix its source somewhere he could put a coordinate to, and it was near the bottom of the switchbacks, where the trail leveled out toward the canyon mouth, that he found the marker. There was a trail sign posted at that junction, standard Forest Service issue, arrow pointing hikers away from the closed section and back toward the main loop. He checked it himself that morning on his way down, confirmed it was properly oriented, made a note of it in his log the way you note anything routine and unremarkable. It was turned around now. Not knocked loose, not fallen and propped back up wrong by accident. Deliberately rotated, the post itself twisted in its mount so the arrow pointed straight into the closed canyon instead of away from it. Exactly the direction a confused or desperate hiker might follow if they came upon it looking for guidance. He stood there a long moment, looking at that arrow, feeling something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. He photographed it on his radio's camera function, more out of habit and procedure than any real expectation it would matter later, and kept moving. The radio crackled again as he reached the canyon floor, static resolving briefly into something almost like words before dissolving back into noise. He kept walking. The whistle had gone quiet for a few minutes, long enough that he'd started to wonder if whoever, whatever, had been making the sound had simply stopped, and then it came again. And this time, there was no mistaking where it was coming from. It was coming from above him. Not from anywhere on the canyon floor, not from any ledge or outcrop the trail actually connected to, but from somewhere up along the canyon's far wall, a stretch of sheer rock face that no trail in the district's system reached, that no hiker, lost or otherwise, could have physically climbed to reach on their own, storm damage or not. He looked up at it for a long time, scanning the rock for any sign of movement, any flash of clothing or gear, anything at all that would explain a person being up there. There was nothing to see, just rock and scrub brush clinging to narrow ledges, and the whistle, 3 short and 1 long, coming down from a place with no trail, no route, no earthly way for anyone to have gotten there. He raised his own whistle to his lips, an old habit, the instinct to answer a distress signal so deeply trained into him that his hand had the whistle out before his mind fully caught up to the decision. He got it halfway to his mouth before he stopped himself, remembering, all at once, every version of the same warning he'd been given that day, the senior ranger's words about Unit 6, his own unease about the timing, the turned marker pointing straight into ground with no business having a trail on it at all. He lowered the whistle. He didn't answer. The sound above him stopped instantly, the way a conversation stops when someone realizes they've been overheard. He didn't descend any further into the canyon. He turned around right there at the base of the switchbacks and made his way back up, moving faster than the storm-damaged trail really allowed. Radio silent against his hip the whole way, refusing to key it even once until he was back at the gate. He logged the incident using only what he could verify: the turned marker, the whistle pattern, the visual assessment of the canyon floor, leaving out the parts that felt too much like something a report couldn't hold without sounding like exactly what it was. When he checked the trail again the next morning before reopening the section, the marker was turned correctly again, arrow pointing away from the closed ground exactly as it should. There was fresh mud on the post, dried now, handled recently by the look of it, though there were no boot prints anywhere near it in the soft ground on either side, no sign at all of who or what had set it right again overnight. He requested the station's radio log for that shift later that week, mostly to satisfy something in his own mind rather than out of any real expectation of finding an answer. The log showed his own check-ins clearly, time-stamped, exactly where they should be, but there was a gap in it, right around the time of the Unit 6 call, a blank 2-minute stretch where nothing had been recorded at all, no transmission logged on either end, though he remembered the exchange clearly enough to describe it word for word to anyone who asked. Nobody at the station could explain the gap. Nobody admitted to making the Unit 6 call, and when he pushed gently about the frequency itself, he was told again that it had been fully decommissioned 2 years prior. No equipment in the district capable of using it. Nothing on record to suggest it had ever transmitted since. He transferred districts the following spring, a routine-looking request that raised no particular questions from anyone above him. He never worked another storm closure shift alone after that, always finding a reason to pair up, always finding it easy enough to justify. He still carries a card in his wallet with that frequency written on it in his own handwriting, though he's never fully explained to anyone, including himself, exactly why. The next account is from a small mountain town where, according to more than one person who grew up there, everyone already knows the ending before you finish telling it. Hello, a contractor working a week-long renovation job in a small Appalachian town says a porch light 2 houses down from his motel turned on by itself at exactly 3:17 every morning, always angled toward the same dark, closed mill at the edge of town. Nobody in the diner seemed surprised when he mentioned it. Nobody in the whole town seemed surprised by much of anything he brought up about that mill at all. He finished the job. He left the next morning. He still turns down work in that county, and he still won't say the name of the town, not even to people who ask him directly. He'd taken the job the way he took most of his work, through a referral from another contractor who didn't do renovation jobs that far off the interstate anymore and didn't mind passing them along. A week's worth of framing and drywall on an old farmhouse just outside town. Decent pay, simple scope, nothing that should have taken longer than the 5 days he'd budgeted for it. The town itself was small enough that he'd driven through the whole of it in under 2 minutes his first evening there. One diner, one motel with a hand-painted sign, a gas station, a sheriff's substation that looked like it saw more paperwork than action, and at the edge of Main Street, set back behind a chain-link fence gone orange with rust, an old lumber mill that had clearly been closed for decades. Broken windows, a sagging roofline, the kind of building that small towns all over Appalachia have 1 or 2 of, monuments to whatever industry used to keep the place alive before it moved on or dried up. He checked into the motel that first night. A small, clean room with a worn plastic key tag and a bedspread that had seen better decades, and had dinner at the diner down the street, the only place open past 7. The waitress was friendly enough, brought him coffee without being asked twice, made the kind of easy small talk you get in towns where everybody already knows everybody, and a new face is instant mild entertainment. He slept fine that first night, or thought he had, until he woke sometime past 2 to a sound he couldn't immediately place. A metallic clang, distant, the kind of noise old industrial buildings make when wind gets into broken structures and finds something loose to rattle. He lay there listening for a minute, decided it was probably coming from the mill, and went back to sleep without much more thought about it. Old buildings settle. Storms had been moving through most weeks that season. It didn't seem worth losing sleep over. The second night, the same sound came again, at almost exactly the same hour, and this time, lying awake afterward, he noticed something else. A porch light 2 houses down from the motel, visible through a gap in his curtains, clicking on with a soft mechanical sound at 3:17 by his phone's clock, angled directly at the mill's dark silhouette across town. He watched it for a few minutes, mildly curious more than anything, and eventually it clicked back off on its own. The porch beneath it dark and still, no sign of anyone awake in the house behind it. He mentioned it at the diner the next morning, mostly as small talk, the kind of odd local detail you bring up to fill conversation with a friendly waitress. She paused for just a second, coffee pot still in her hand, before saying something non-committal about old wiring and old habits, and moved on to refill someone else's cup at the counter. Nobody in town seemed surprised when he mentioned it. That bothered him more than the light itself. He got back to work that day, framing walls in the farmhouse's addition, and didn't think much more about it until that night, when the mill's clanging fell into a rhythm he hadn't noticed before. Steady, patient. And then, at exactly 3:17, cutting off entirely the same instant the porch light down the street clicked on, as though the two things were tied to the same clock, the same switch, the same unseen hand. He started timing it out of curiosity after that. Every night, 3:17, without variation, the clang stopping the instant the light came on, the light staying lit for almost exactly 4 minutes before switching off again on its own. By midweek, he'd started asking around a little more directly, the way you do when a strange detail starts feeling less like a coincidence and more like something everyone else already understands and simply isn't saying out loud. He asked the motel owner about the mill's history over coffee one morning, casual, and got a short answer about the place closing sometime in the 50s. A labor accident nobody talked about much anymore. Nothing more specific than that. "Don't ask about the mill after dark," the man added, almost as an afterthought, refilling his own cup without quite meeting his eyes. "Folks here just don't." He asked the waitress again, more directly this time, and watched her go quiet mid-sentence, her easy small-town friendliness dropping away for just a moment before she recovered it and changed the subject to something about the weather. That night, walking back from the diner, he noticed a sheriff's deputy cruiser rolling slowly past the mill's fence line, headlights sweeping the dark building's broken windows, not stopping, not getting out, just passing at a crawl and continuing on down Main Street. The way, he'd later learn, that particular deputy did every single night without exception. He found the photo 2 days after that, framed and hanging on the diner's back wall among a cluster of old town pictures nobody seemed to look at closely anymore. A group shot from the mill's last working shift. Men in coveralls posed in front of the building back when its windows were whole and its roofline was straight. The same house with the porch light was visible in the background of the photo, decades old, faded and creased. The porch light in the photo was on. That was the first thing that didn't fit. The photo was from the 50s. The bulb looked brand new in both pictures, the one on the wall and the one 2 houses down from his motel, 60-some years apart, burning the exact same steady white. He stood in front of that photo longer than he meant to, long enough that the waitress noticed and came over, following his gaze to the same faded image he'd been staring at. He asked her, careful this time, not pushing, just curious out loud, whether that house down the street still had the same porch light after all these years. She looked at the photo a moment, then at him, and something in her expression closed off the way a door does when someone remembers, halfway through opening it, that they didn't actually want company. "Could be," she said, and refilled a cup that didn't need refilling, and that was the end of that conversation. His truck started giving him trouble the next morning. A rough idle that turned into a full stall out in the farmhouse's gravel driveway. Engine cranking, but refusing to catch no matter how many times he tried. He called the only mechanic listed in town, a small shop just past the gas station, and got a recorded message saying they were closed until further notice. No explanation given, no return call when he left one. That was inconvenient in a way that felt, at first, like nothing more than bad luck. Small towns had one of everything, and if the one mechanic was out, you waited or you drove somewhere bigger. Except the drive to the next town over was 40 minutes each way on roads he didn't know, and the job wasn't finished yet. And something about the timing of it all had started to feel less like coincidence than like the town, or something in it, simply wasn't quite ready to let him leave yet. He ended up staying 3 extra nights past his original schedule, working the job during the day and lying awake most of each night listening for 317, unable to help himself even as some part of him understood that watching for it wasn't going to make the town any easier to be in. The mill's clanging had settled fully into rhythm with the porch light by then, so consistent he could have set a clock by it if he'd wanted to, though he found he didn't. The deputy's cruiser kept its same slow pass each night, headlights sweeping the fence line and moving on without stopping, a routine so worn into the town's rhythm that he started to understand it wasn't caution at all. It was simply what you did, the way you'd check a door was locked before bed without really thinking about why you'd started the habit in the first place. He asked the motel owner one more time, his final night in town, whether anyone had ever gone into the mill to see what was actually happening in there. The man was quiet a long moment, wiping down the same stretch of counter he'd already wiped twice. "Some things folks just leave be," he said eventually. "Mill's been standing there longer than most of us, longer than the town's had a name people used twice." He didn't elaborate further, and something about the way he said it made clear that no amount of asking was going to get more out of him than that. That was the first thing that didn't fit right, sitting with the rest of it later. The idea that a building could be older than the town's own name, in a place that had clearly been settled and working that mill for at least 100 years by any account he could find. He didn't push it. Some part of him understood by then that pushing wasn't going to get him an answer, only a longer silence. His last night in town, job finally finished, truck limping but running well enough to get him home the next morning. He lay awake again past 3, telling himself he'd just sleep once he'd seen the light come on one final time. The way you tell yourself you'll close your eyes after just one more episode, one more scroll, one more small thing before the real rest begins. At 3:17, the light clicked on exactly as it had every night before. The mill's clanging stopped in the same instant, the whole town going quiet in a way that felt, for the first time all week, less like absence and more like something holding still on purpose. He lay there another minute, and then, almost without deciding to, he got up, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the cool night air, telling himself he just wanted a closer look, just once before he left for good. The street was empty the whole walk down, no cars, no lights in any window except the one 2 houses down, still burning steady behind him as he moved further from the motel. His own footsteps sounded too loud on the cracked sidewalk, the kind of quiet that makes you very aware of your own body moving through it. The mill's fence came up faster than he expected, chain link gone soft and orange with rust, a padlocked gate hanging slightly open on hinges that looked like they hadn't closed properly in years. He stopped there, hands loose at his sides, close enough now to see clearly through the gaps in the fence into the dark building beyond. Broken machinery still standing in rows inside, shapes he couldn't quite make sense of in the dark, the kind of industrial skeleton that gets left behind when a place closes fast and nobody ever comes back to finish clearing it out properly. He checked his phone. 3:17, on the nose. The clanging, which had been steady and rhythmic every single night he'd listened to it, stopped completely the instant he read the time off his screen. Not fading, not tapering into silence the way sound naturally does when it winds down. It simply cut off, all at once, and what followed wasn't the ordinary quiet of a sleeping town at night. It was a different kind of silence, total and pressing, the kind that makes your own breathing sound like an intrusion. He stood at that fence a long moment, staring into the dark building, feeling something in the pit of his stomach that he'd later describe as less like fear and more like the specific, wordless understanding that he was somewhere he had no business being, that whatever quiet arrangement the town had made with that building over however many decades, he wasn't part of it. And standing there uninvited felt, suddenly, like the single worst decision he'd made all week. He didn't go any closer. He didn't climb the fence, didn't push through the half-open gate, didn't do any of the things some other version of that story might have had him do out of curiosity or bravado. He turned around, right there, and walked back to the motel at a steady pace that wasn't quite a run but wasn't far from it either. And he didn't look back over his shoulder once, the whole way, the same way he realized later. The deputy never looked back either. Every single night, headlights sweeping past and moving on without a second glance. He slept fitfully what remained of that night, up before his alarm, packed and loaded, before the diner had even opened for the morning. He stopped by anyway, on his way out of town, mostly to settle the bill and say a proper goodbye to the waitress who'd been kind to him all week, despite her careful, guarded answers about everything that actually mattered. She walked him out to his truck, arms crossed against the morning chill, and it was there, in the gravel lot, that he mentioned the fence, the gate hanging open, the drag marks he'd noticed cutting through the dirt beneath it that he hadn't seen on any of his earlier walks past that building. Fresh, deep, like something heavy had been pulled across the ground recently, despite nothing inside the mill looking disturbed at all when he'd peered through the gaps in the fence. She didn't ask what he'd been doing at the mill fence at 3 a.m. She didn't ask anything at all. She just looked at him for a moment, something tired and old behind her eyes, and said, "Most people just don't ask twice." And that was the whole of her answer, delivered flat and final, the way you'd close a conversation you'd already had 100 times with 100 other people who'd passed through and asked the same questions and gotten the same silence back. He didn't ask a third time. He got in his truck and he drove out of that town the way he'd driven into it, past the diner, past the gas station, past the sheriff's substation, past the mill's rusted fence one final time in his mirror, and he kept driving until the trees closed in around the road and the town disappeared behind him entirely. He's turned down 2 more jobs in that county since, both good money, both referred by contractors who don't know why he says no. He tells the story now only when someone else brings up small towns first, never volunteering it himself, and he still won't say the name of the place. Not out of any promise he made to anyone, but because some part of him suspects that saying it out loud, to the wrong person, in the wrong place, might be its own kind of asking twice. The next account is shorter, from a hunting trip that went wrong on a back road far from any town at all. Hay, a hunter in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, says his own whistle came back to him before he'd even finished blowing it. The exact signal his father taught him, echoed from across a hollow with no possible way for real sound to travel that fast. He'd been alone on family land he'd hunted since he was a boy, following an old rule out of habit more than belief. He made it back to his truck by mid-morning. He never hunts that low ground alone anymore, and the whistle that answered him that day still sits, untouched, in a drawer at home. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. A couple hundred acres of ridge and hollow his grandfather had bought back when land like that went for almost nothing. Passed down through his father, and now, in practice if not yet on paper, mostly managed by him. He knew every deer stand, every logging road, every creek crossing on that property better than he knew most rooms in his own house. He'd hunted it alone more times than he could count, every season since he was old enough to carry a rifle by himself. He was out before dawn that morning, the way he always was, parking his truck at the old logging road turnout and hiking in by headlamp to a stand overlooking a stretch of hardwood bottom that had always produced well. The frost was heavy that early, crunching under his boots in a way that made him move slower and quieter than usual, careful not to spook anything before he'd even gotten settled. He climbed into the stand, checked the wind, which was steady and favorable, and settled in with his thermos of black coffee and the particular stillness that comes with waiting for first light in cold woods. His father's old rules ran through his head the way they always did on mornings like that. Half-remembered instructions passed down over years of hunting together before his father's knees had gotten too bad to make the climb anymore. Check the wind twice. Never shoot at movement alone. And the one that had always struck him as more superstition than practical advice: don't answer if something calls back before you finish your own whistle. He'd never fully understood that last one, not the way he understood the others. His father had never explained it beyond the flat statement itself, delivered the same way every time it came up. No elaboration, no story attached to it that he'd ever heard. It was just one of those family rules that outlived its own explanation, followed out of respect for where it came from, rather than any clear sense of what it protected against. Around mid-morning, with nothing having moved through the bottom in hours, he pulled the hunting whistle from his jacket pocket, a signal call he sometimes used to communicate position with other hunters on the property when they were working the land together. 3 short blasts that carried well across the hollow's open ground. There was nobody else out there with him that day, but he blew it anyway, mostly out of habit, testing the morning's quiet more than actually expecting a response. Something answered from across the hollow. Same pattern, 3 short blasts, clear as anything. And for one instant his first thought was pure relief. Somebody else was out hunting the adjacent property. Somebody he could maybe coordinate with. Somebody whose presence out there suddenly made the whole cold morning feel less solitary. Then his brain caught up to what he'd actually just heard, and the relief curdled into something colder than the frost on the ground around him. The echo had come back before he'd finished his own whistle. Not after. Not with the natural delay you'd expect from sound crossing that distance and bouncing back, but overlapping his own final note, arriving too fast for any real sound traveling across real ground to have managed it. He sat very still in the stand for a long moment, telling himself he'd misjudged the timing, that adrenaline and cold, and an early morning alone in the woods were playing tricks with his sense of things. He tried it again, deliberately this time, watching the second hand on his watch as he blew the signal, counting the beats between his own whistle ending and the answer beginning. The gap was less than a second. He timed it out loud, twice, just to be sure. The math didn't work either time. Sound doesn't cross a quarter mile of open hollow and bounce back off a ridge in under a second. Not by any physics he understood. Not by any hunting trip he'd ever been on in his life. He sat in that stand a long while after that, whistle held loose in his hand, watching the tree line across the hollow for any sign of movement that might explain it. Another hunter, closer than he'd guessed, some quirk of the terrain amplifying an ordinary echo in a way that just felt wrong, because he wasn't used to it. Nothing moved. The morning stayed still and cold and silent in every way, except for the memory of that answer, arriving too fast, in a pattern that matched his own whistle exactly. He climbed down from the stand a little after that, telling himself he'd work his way toward the low ground along the creek. The stretch his father had always called simply the low ground, and always, without fail, avoided hunting himself. He told himself he was just moving to a better spot, closer to where the deer had been bedding down lately, and that was even mostly true. But some part of him, walking that old logging road with the rifle slung over his shoulder, knew he was also testing something, chasing down an explanation for a sound that shouldn't have been possible, telling himself the low ground would either produce another hunter he could talk to face or nothing at all, and either answer would settle his mind. The fog had started settling into the hollow by then, the kind that comes up off low, wet ground on cold mornings and pools thick enough to swallow detail at 20 yards. He kept to the tree line as he walked, moving quiet out of habit, and it was maybe 15 minutes into that walk when he noticed the shape. It was moving parallel to him through the trees on the far side of a shallow draw, matching his pace exactly, close enough to register as a shape and no closer. A deer-sized presence, he told himself at first. Something with weight and purpose to its movement, keeping to the cover of the trunks the way any wild animal moves when it doesn't want to be seen clearly. He stopped walking to get a better look. The shape stopped too, in the same instant, disappearing behind a trunk and staying there, motionless, exactly as long as he stood still himself. He started walking again, testing it, watching from the corner of his eye rather than looking straight at it, the way you learn to watch game without spooking it. The shape resumed too, same pace, same distance, never closing the gap between them and never falling behind either, matching him step for step through fog that thinned and thickened by turns, and never once let him see it clearly enough to call it anything at all. His father's rule surfaced in his mind again, clearer now than it had been all morning. Don't answer if something calls back before you finish your own whistle. He'd already answered it, twice, and whatever had answered him was here now, walking beside him through the fog toward the exact stretch of low ground his father had spent his whole life steering clear of. He checked his handheld radio out of habit, more for reassurance than any real expectation of using it. No other hunters on the property that day, nobody to call even if he needed to. It gave him nothing but static, worse than it should have been that close to the truck, worse than any dead zone he remembered from that section of the land before. The creek crossing came up out of the fog sooner than he expected. A shallow, narrow stretch of water his father had always simply called the low ground, never explaining further, never needing to, because the tone in which he said it had always been explanation enough. He stopped at the bank, looking down at the mud there, and saw his own boot prints from earlier that morning, clear in the soft ground on the near bank exactly where he'd crossed on his way out before dawn. There was a second set of prints beside them, barefoot, human-shaped, crossing in the opposite direction, from the far bank toward the near one, and by the depth and freshness of them, arriving well before he had hours before, judging by how the frost had settled unevenly around the edges of them compared to his own fresher tracks. He stood there a long time looking at those prints, the shape and the fog gone still again on the far side of the draw. Watching him, he was fairly certain, though he couldn't have said how he knew that, with the fog as thick as it was. He didn't call out. He didn't raise the rifle toward the tree line, though his hand drifted toward the strap without quite deciding to. He backed away from the creek slowly, whistle still in his jacket pocket, unused, and made his way back up along the logging road toward his truck, with the shape keeping pace beside him through the fog the entire way, never closing distance, never falling behind, right up until the tree line finally opened onto the gravel turnout and his truck came into view. At which point, he'd say later, it simply wasn't there anymore, gone the way fog itself goes when you finally step clear of it. He drove straight home, didn't field dress anything, didn't stop at the gas station for coffee the way he usually did on the way back from a hunt. He got home a little before noon, and it was his wife who noticed it first, sitting out on the porch rail when he pulled in. His father's old hunting whistle, kept for years in a drawer in the hall closet, not carried with him that morning, not touched by anyone in the house as far as either of them could account for, sitting there in plain sight on the rail as though someone had set it down and walked away. He never hunts the low ground alone now. He walked that same creek crossing again weeks later in full daylight, his nephew beside him, and found the creek itself barely 8 feet across. Nothing like the distance it had felt like that foggy dawn. He's passed his father's rule on to his nephew since, the same flat, unexplained instruction, word for word, exactly as it was given to him, and he's never once tried to explain what it actually protects against, because he still doesn't fully know, and some part of him has decided he doesn't want to. The next story returns to a cabin, this one belonging to a family for 3 generations, and the room they stopped using long before anyone renting it ever asked why. Listen. A woman clearing out her late grandfather's cabin says she heard something pacing in an upstairs room with no door, heel to toe, always exactly 7 steps before it turned. The room had sat empty for as long as anyone in the family could remember. She was alone on the property for a week, sorting decades of belongings before the land sale went through. She never went up those stairs after dark again. She still has the old photograph she found in a drawer, the one with a figure in it nobody in her family has ever been able to identify. Her grandfather had passed that spring, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of ending everyone said was a mercy after the slow decline of the last few years. The cabin had been in the family since her great-grandfather built it by hand, added onto over decades as the family grew and shrank again. And now it fell to her, as the one grandchild with the flexibility to take the time, to sort through what remained of a lifetime's belongings before the land went up for sale. She'd arrived on a Monday, planning to stay through the following weekend, enough time, she figured, to work through the attic, the root cellar, the closets full of clothes nobody had thought to clear out yet, and get the place presentable for whoever came to walk through it with a realtor. She'd brought boxes, packing tape, a cooler of food, and enough optimism about the task ahead that the actual scale of it didn't fully register until she stood in the front room that first afternoon, surrounded by 70 years of accumulated life. The cabin had electricity, at least, unlike some of the older places still standing in that part of the hollow, though the wood stove remained the main source of heat, same as it had been her grandfather's whole life. She got it going that first evening more out of habit than necessity, the September evening still mild enough that she probably could have gone without. But something about the ritual of it, splitting kindling, feeding the fire, watching it catch, felt like the right way to spend her first night alone in a house that had never, in her memory, been quiet like this before. She worked through the front room first, sorting through boxes of photographs and old letters, finding an ancient guest book tucked into a drawer that friends and family had signed over the decades whenever they'd stayed, and a stack of photo albums going back further than she'd expected. Black and white images of relatives she recognized only from stories, gathered on that same porch, that same land, generation after generation. It was well after dark, sitting with a cup of tea and half watching the fire settle, when she first heard the pacing. It came from directly above her, steady footsteps moving across the upstairs floor in a rhythm too even, too deliberate, to be anything as simple as the house settling. She sat very still, listening, telling herself it was probably some kind of pest, a raccoon or possum that had found its way in through a gap somewhere while the house sat empty those first months after her grandfather's death. A common enough problem in old cabins nobody had gotten around to sealing up fully, but the rhythm didn't match anything an animal would produce. It was too regular, heel to toe, a consistent path back and forth across the same stretch of floor, and without quite meaning to, she found herself counting the steps along with it. 7. Every time, 7 steps, and then a pause, and then the same 7 steps back in the other direction. She sat with that for a long moment before getting up, taking the lamp, and walking to the base of the stairs to look up into the dark hallway above. The pacing continued the whole time she stood there, unbothered by her presence, by the light, by anything at all, and she found she didn't have the nerve that first night to climb up and look for herself. She told herself it could wait until morning, that whatever it was would be easier to deal with in daylight, and went back to the fire instead, the wood stove ticking as it worked through the last of its heat, old paper smell still hanging in the air from the albums she'd been sorting. She knew the layout of that upstairs floor well enough from childhood visits. 2 bedrooms, a small bathroom added sometime in the 70s, and at the far end of the hall, a 3rd room that had never, in her entire memory, had a door on it, just an open frame. The room beyond it always kept closed off with old furniture stacked in front of the gap, unused for as long as she could remember, though nobody had ever quite explained to her, growing up, exactly why. She fell asleep on the couch that night rather than climbing those stairs at all, telling herself it was just more convenient, closer to the fire, easier than making up a bed upstairs she'd have to make up again before she left. Somewhere in the small hours, half dreaming, she thought she heard the pacing continue, steady and patient, the same 7 steps carrying on long after she'd stopped consciously counting them. And by the time real morning light came through the front windows, she'd half convinced herself the whole thing had been nothing more than an unfamiliar house settling around an unfamiliar sleeper. Easy enough to explain away in daylight the way these things always are. That explanation held for almost the entire day that followed. It wouldn't hold much longer than that. She spent that second day doing exactly what she'd planned, working steadily through the attic, sorting decades of belongings into keep, donate, and discard piles that grew and shrank as she second-guessed herself over things that had no real value except the memory attached to them. It was good, honest work, the kind that kept her hands busy enough to not think too hard about the previous night. And by early afternoon, she'd nearly convinced herself the pacing had been exactly what she'd told herself it was in the morning light. An old house, unfamiliar sounds, an overactive imagination working overtime in a place thick with grief. It was in a drawer of her grandfather's old roll-top desk, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed insurance papers, that she found the photograph. It was a family gathering, judging by the clothes and the faded color quality, sometime in the 70s by her guess. A dozen or so relatives arranged loosely on the cabin's front lawn. Some she recognized immediately, her grandfather younger and dark-haired among them, her own mother as a child sitting cross-legged in the front row. Ordinary, warm, exactly the kind of photograph that should have made her smile. Except there was a figure standing at the tree line behind the group, slightly out of focus, that she didn't recognize at all. Not close enough to have been posing with the family, not far enough to be some unrelated passerby caught accidentally in frame. Just standing there, watching the gathering, in a way that felt, the longer she looked at it, less like a stranger who'd wandered into frame, and more like someone who'd been invited to watch from exactly that distance and no closer. She called her aunt that evening, using the one spot near the cabin's mailbox where a bar of cell signal sometimes held long enough for a call, hoping for some easy explanation. A neighbor, a family friend, someone whose identity had simply slipped from memory over the decades. Her aunt was quiet on the line for a long moment when she described the figure, long enough that she asked if the call had dropped. "I don't know who that'd be," her aunt said finally, and then, before she could ask a follow-up question, added something that had nothing to do with the photo at all. "You're not sleeping up there, are you? In the back room?" She said no, mentioned she'd been sleeping downstairs by the fire, and her aunt's relief was audible even through the thin, crackling signal. "Good, don't sleep up there. We stopped using that room before you were even born." Nobody ever really said why, not that I remember, just that we stopped. She pressed a little, asking what her aunt meant, whether something had happened, whether there was a story behind it worth knowing. Her aunt only repeated the warning, gentler but firmer the second time, and changed the subject to logistics about the sale before she could ask again. She thought about that conversation a lot as the evening wore on, sitting again by the fire with the photograph propped against a lamp where she could keep looking at it, at that unfamiliar figure at the tree line, dressed in clothes that seemed, on closer inspection, slightly wrong for the era of the photo around it. A little too plain, a little too formless to place confidently in any particular decade at all. The pacing started again the moment she turned off the last downstairs light to head to the couch for the night. Same rhythm, same 7 steps, heel to toe, turn, 7 steps back. She lay there in the dark, listening to it, telling herself it would stop the way most unfamiliar house sounds eventually stop once you've been in a place a few nights and your ear adjusts to its particular voice. It didn't stop. It carried on steady through most of the night, and somewhere in the exhausted, half-awake hours before dawn, an idea surfaced that she couldn't quite shake once it had. That maybe, if she used the time more efficiently, she should just sleep upstairs for the rest of the week instead of camping out on the couch every night. The back bedrooms would be more comfortable. It would save her the trips up and down the stairs to fetch things. It was, on the surface, a perfectly reasonable idea, the kind any practical person clearing out an inherited house might land on given enough tired nights on an old couch. Her aunt's voice came back to her clearly the moment the thought crossed her mind. "Don't sleep up there." She didn't move upstairs. She stayed on the couch that third night too, though sleep came harder and harder each time, the pacing above her a constant now, a fixture of the house as reliable as the tick of the wood stove cooling after the fire died down. It was the next morning, scrolling back through photos she'd taken herself for the eventual real estate listing, that she found it. A shot of the front porch and yard she'd taken on her very first evening there, meant to capture the cabin's curb appeal for whatever agent eventually took the listing. There, at the tree line, in almost the exact spot the unfamiliar figure occupied in her grandfather's decades-old photograph, was a shape. Faint, half obscured by shadow, easy to dismiss as a trick of light and foliage if she hadn't already spent 2 days staring at its twin from 40 years earlier. She'd taken that picture for the listing, She hadn't taken it for anyone else to be in it. She sat with that photo a long time, comparing it side by side with the old one from the drawer. And the longer she looked, the harder it became to explain away as coincidence or trick of light. Same distance from the house. Same rough posture. Same stillness that felt, in both images, less like an accidental subject caught wandering into frame, and more like something that had simply always been standing exactly there, watching, whether anyone was taking a picture or not. She didn't sleep well the rest of that week. The pacing continued every night without fail, the moment the last downstairs light went off. Steady and patient. 7 steps and a turn. 7 steps back. She kept the fire going later than she needed to most nights. Kept a lamp burning on the side table even after she'd finally give in to exhaustion, and found herself, more than once, simply lying still and counting along with the rhythm above her without meaning to, the way you catch yourself humming along to a song you didn't choose to hear. The land sale paperwork required her to stay through the full week. Signatures needed in person from the family's lawyer. Documents that couldn't be rushed no matter how much she found herself wanting to cut the trip short. The nearest neighbor was a 20-minute drive on unpaved road, someone she'd never actually met despite her grandfather having lived beside them for decades. The cabin's old landline had gone dead sometime in the last few years, disconnected and never reinstated, and cell signal only held weekly near the mailbox at the end of the drive. Leaving quickly, if it ever came to that, would not have been simple. On her last full night before the paperwork was due to be finalized the next morning, she found herself standing at the base of the stairs again, later than she meant to be awake, listening to the pacing continue above her in the dark. Something in her, some combination of exhaustion and stubbornness, and a week's worth of unanswered questions, decided she wasn't going to spend one more night lying on that couch pretending she hadn't heard what she'd clearly heard every single night since she arrived. She climbed the first few steps slowly, lamp held low, counting along with the rhythm above her the way she had every night from a distance, only now doing it deliberately, out loud almost, matching her own steps to the pattern she'd memorized without ever meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The pacing above her continued in perfect time with her count. 4, 5, 6, both rhythms moving together now, her own footsteps, and the ones overhead rising and falling in a kind of unintentional unison that made the hair on her arms stand up, even as some detached part of her mind noted, almost clinically, how precisely it was tracking her. She reached the 7th step. The pacing stopped instantly, mid-stride by the sound of it, cutting off exactly as she planted her foot on that final stair. And what followed wasn't relief. It was a silence so complete and so pointed that she found herself certain, standing there in the dark stairwell with her lamp throwing weak light up into the hallway above, that whatever had been pacing that room all week had simply stopped to look back down at her, counting along in return. She didn't go any further. She backed down those 7 steps one at a time, faster than she'd climbed them, and by the time her feet hit the front room floor again, her hands were shaking badly enough that the lamp flame guttered and nearly went out. She locked the front door that night, though the cabin had never needed locking in her entire memory of it, the old bolt sticking and stubborn from decades of disuse before finally sliding home. And she sat up by the wood stove until the sky outside began to lighten, refusing to close her eyes even once. She checked the upstairs floor properly in daylight before she left that morning, finally climbing all the way up with the sun well over the ridge and every downstairs light on behind her. The hallway looked exactly as it always had. Old floorboards, faded runner rug, the open door frame at the far end leading into the room without a door, dark and empty as it had always been in her memory of visiting as a child. but the dust on the floor near that doorway, undisturbed by her own account for months while the cabin sat empty, showed drag marks. Faint ones, running from somewhere near the center of the room to the exact edge of the door frame, and stopping there completely, as though something had paced right up to that threshold, every single night, and gone no further than the boundary of a door that had never actually existed. She finished the sale paperwork that afternoon and left the property before dark, and she has never gone back, not even out of curiosity, not even a year later when a cousin who bought the place mentioned offhand that they'd finally added an actual door to that room, just because the open frame had always felt unfinished to them, and that they hadn't noticed anything unusual themselves in all the months since. She still has the old photograph. She keeps it in a drawer now, the same kind of drawer her grandfather kept it in, and she has never quite worked up the nerve to ask her aunt again what the family actually stopped talking about all those decades ago, or why. The next account is from a park ranger working a night shift near a fire tower, called out for something that, on paper, should not have needed a response at all. Hello. A young ranger working his first solo overnight fire watch says something inside a padlocked equipment shed below his tower, kept perfect time with his own hourly log checks. 3 sounds, a pause, 3 more, on the hour, every hour, though he'd never told a single person his schedule. Storm damage from the week before had made the shift routine procedural, nothing that should have needed more than a clipboard and a flashlight. He made it to sunrise. He still radios in twice now, even when reception's fine, and he's never worked that tower alone since. He was new to the district that season, barely 6 months into the job, still young enough that the older rangers treated him with the particular mix of patience and mild amusement reserved for anyone who hadn't yet had the job humble them properly. Fire watch rotations were routine work, mostly boring by design. Sit in the tower, log conditions, watch for smoke, report anything unusual. He'd drawn an overnight shift following storm damage from the week before, tasked with assessing conditions and keeping an eye on things while cleanup crews worked the roads below during daylight hours. The senior ranger handing off the shift walked him through the basics with the efficient patience of someone who'd done this handoff 100 times before. Radio check-in schedule, log requirements, weather protocols. At the very end, almost as an afterthought while gathering his own gear to head out, he mentioned the equipment shed at the base of the tower. If the shed door's open when you get up there, just close it. Don't go in after dark. He said it the same easy, offhand way you'd mention a loose step or a sticky lock, already halfway to his truck, and the younger ranger didn't think to ask for more explanation than that. It seemed like ordinary caution. Storm-damaged structure, uneven ground at night, nothing worth reading into. He settled into the tower as evening came on, going through the motions of his hourly checks with the careful thoroughness of someone still eager enough in the job to want to do it right. Wind speed, visibility, a note on cloud cover as the last of the daylight gave way to full dark. He ate a cold sandwich at the watch desk around 8, radio humming with occasional low chatter from other units in the district, and settled in for what he expected to be a long, quiet, uneventful night. The first sound came around 9, faint from the shed below, a metallic shifting, the kind of noise you'd expect from storm-loosened tools settling against each other, or a piece of equipment that hadn't been properly secured before the last crew left. He noted it in his log almost as a formality, attributed it easily to the storm, and went back to his weather checks without much further thought. It came again at 10, right as he was completing his hourly log entry, and again at 11, in the same window. By midnight, he'd started to notice something about the pattern that made the easy explanation feel less comfortable than it had a few hours earlier. 3 distinct sounds, a pause, 3 more, always arriving within a minute or two of him finishing his own hourly check, as though whatever was making the noise below was keeping time with his own schedule, rather than any storm-related settling of loose metal. He hadn't told anyone his log schedule. It was just habit, hourly on the dot, the kind of personal routine that develops naturally over months on the job and isn't written down anywhere for anyone else to reference. The shed didn't know that. Or it did. He climbed down partway around 1 in the morning, more out of a young ranger's stubborn need to rule out the mundane explanation than any real desire to investigate further, and confirmed from a safe distance, flashlight sweeping the base of the structure, that the shed's padlock was exactly where it should be, closed and intact on the hasp. He climbed back up, noted the confirmation in his log, and told himself the sound was mechanical, explainable, nothing worth losing sleep over. It was around 2, doing his electrical panel check after noticing the tower's exterior light seemed to be behaving strangely, that things stopped feeling explainable at all. The exterior light mounted below the observation deck had started blinking in a pattern he couldn't account for. Not the steady flicker of a failing bulb, not the erratic stutter of a loose wire, but something with actual structure to it, on and off in groups that repeated too consistently to be a simple fault. He went through the tower's electrical panel methodically, checking connections, testing the breaker, running through every diagnostic step he'd been trained on, and found nothing wrong. No loose wire, no failing component, nothing that should have been producing a pattern like that at all. The light kept blinking anyway, steady and rhythmic, visible through the tower's windows even as he worked. He was still crouched at the panel when he glanced down toward the shed, almost by accident, and saw that the door, padlocked and confirmed closed less than an hour earlier by his own hand, was standing slightly open now, a dark gap visible along its edge in the wash of the blinking light. He remembered the senior ranger's instruction clearly enough, word for word, delivered so casually he'd almost forgotten it entirely until this exact moment. If the shed door's open when you get up there, just close it. Don't go in after dark. He'd assumed, at the time, that the instruction applied to arrival, to the start of a shift, not to something that happened partway through the night while he was up in the tower with no easy way down that didn't mean leaving his post and descending into the dark alone. He radioed it in instead, keeping his voice level, reporting the open shed door and requesting guidance rather than going down to deal with it himself. Dispatch acknowledged, told him to sit tight, that they'd note it and have someone swing by if needed. He logged the call, logged the time, and settled back to watch the shed from above, telling himself the door had probably just come loose in the wind, that padlocks failed sometimes, that there was a reasonable explanation waiting somewhere in the ordinary mechanics of old hardware and storm-stressed hinges. The storm rolled back through around 2:30, faster and harder than the forecast had suggested, and his radio reception started dropping in and out almost immediately, reduced to intermittent bursts of static-laced chatter that told him little beyond the fact that backup, whenever it came, was still a good 40 minutes out on roads that were about to get considerably worse. The tower's stairs were the only way down, exposed the whole length of them to weather and to whatever was or wasn't happening around that shed below. It was sometime past 3, reception briefly clearing enough for a real exchange, that dispatch mentioned, almost in passing, that they had no record of his earlier call about the shed door. No transmission logged. Nothing in the system to indicate he'd radioed anything about it at all, despite the fact that he could recall the exchange clearly enough to repeat it back to them nearly word for word, including the specific acknowledgement he remembered receiving in return. He didn't push the point. Something about arguing with dispatch over a missing radio log at 3 in the morning, alone in a storm-battered tower with a shed door standing open below him, felt like an argument that wasn't going to end anywhere useful. He stayed exactly where he was for the rest of that night. He didn't descend to deal with the shed himself, didn't investigate the open door, didn't do anything except sit at the watch desk with his flashlight trained on that dark gap in the shed's siding, watching it, waiting, until the first gray hint of dawn finally started softening the sky and, not long after, the wash of actual headlights appeared on the service road below, backup finally arriving to relieve him. They checked the shed together once the sun was fully up, both of them approaching it in ordinary daylight with the kind of confidence that comes easily once the dark has lifted. The padlock was closed, intact, secure, exactly as it should be, except positioned upside down on the hasp, the shackle facing a direction neither of them could account for having turned it. Not in the course of any normal use either ranger had ever made of that lock. They inventoried the shed's contents that week as a matter of routine follow-up. Nothing was missing. Nothing appeared disturbed inside at all, despite the open door, despite the pattern of sounds that had kept time with his log checks half the night, despite a blinking light with no mechanical explanation, and a radio call that had somehow never made it into any official record. He filed his storm damage report normally that morning, leaving out most of what had actually kept him awake. The way he'd already learned, in barely 6 months on the job, that some things simply didn't translate well onto a standard incident form. He's never worked that particular tower shift alone again since, always finding a reason, always finding it easy enough to justify to whoever's scheduling. And he radios in twice now, every check, every hour, repeating himself even when the reception is perfectly clear, a habit nobody's ever questioned and one he's never fully explained, even to himself. 2 more accounts follow, both from campers, both from different counties, that end almost the same way. Hey, a couple on a backcountry trip say the creek running past their campsite went completely silent at midnight, the same creek that had roared steady since the moment they arrived, and that by morning, muddy footprints circled their tent in a tight ring, every single one of them facing inward, none leading away. They'd camped that exact site twice before without a single strange thing happening. They finished the trip. They never camped that loop again, and neither of them will unzip a tent at night now without listening first, no matter how familiar the voice outside sounds. They were experienced backcountry campers, the kind who planned routes carefully and packed light, and knew the difference between a genuinely dangerous situation and the ordinary discomforts of sleeping outdoors for days at a stretch. This particular loop was a familiar one to them, a 3-day route they'd hiked twice before over the years, always camping the 3rd night at the same established site. Flat ground, reliable water from a creek that ran loud and constant along the edge of the clearing, dense tree cover that kept the wind off. Everything a backcountry site needed to feel safe and workable. They arrived at the site mid-afternoon on their 3rd day, following the same routine they always followed there. Filtering water from the creek into their bottles, hanging the bear box on the cable strung between 2 trees at the site's edge, stringing a line to dry out socks that had gotten damp crossing a shallow ford earlier that day. The trailhead register, when they'd signed in 3 days earlier, had included a note from a previous hiker in unfamiliar handwriting, tucked in among the usual mundane entries about trail conditions and wildlife sightings. Site 4 gets loud at night. Don't feed it curiosity. They'd laughed about it at the time, the kind of cryptic backcountry humor that gets left in registers all the time, half joke, half performance for whoever reads it next. The evening passed the way evenings on that loop always had for them. Dinner, cooked over a small stove, the creek's steady rush a comforting backdrop to conversation that wound down naturally as the light faded and the temperature dropped. They were in the tent and settling in for sleep by 9, The creek's noise, a familiar white sound they'd both grown so used to over 3 days that neither of them consciously registered it anymore. The way you stop hearing a fan running once you've been in a room with it long enough. It was sometime around midnight that the silence woke one of them. Not a sound, an absence of one, sudden and complete. The creek's constant rush simply gone, replaced by a stillness so total it took a long, disoriented moment lying there in the dark to understand what exactly had changed. They lay listening together after that, both awake now, waiting for the creek to resume the way you'd wait out a lull in rain, assuming some natural cause. A beaver dam shifting somewhere upstream, a temporary blockage working itself loose, some ordinary hydrological quirk they'd simply never happened to witness on their previous 2 trips through that same site. The creek came back after several long minutes, rushing steady again, as if it had never stopped at all, and they told each other it had probably been exactly what they'd guessed. Some upstream obstruction clearing itself, nothing more significant than that. They'd camped that site twice before. The creek had never once gone quiet. It happened again closer to 1, the same sudden total silence, and this time, in the stillness that followed, they both heard something else. A soft, unhurried sound just outside the range of the dying firelight, moving in what felt, even through the thin nylon walls of the tent, distinctly like a slow circle around the edge of their camp. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, both listening hard, and it was the wife who finally whispered the obvious observation neither of them had wanted to voice first. The creek's noise wasn't just background sound. It had been masking something the whole time, and now, whenever it stopped, they could hear exactly what that something was. They didn't leave the tent that night. They lay still, listening to the slow, deliberate circling continue at the edge of their small clearing for what felt like far longer than it probably actually was. Neither one closing their eyes again until well after the sound had finally faded, and the creek's steady rush had reasserted itself for good sometime before dawn. Morning brought the kind of relief that only comes after a genuinely bad night. Sunlight filtering warm through the trees. The creek running exactly as loud and ordinary as it always had on their previous trips. They stepped out of the tent, already telling themselves the whole thing had probably been a bear, drawn by their food smells despite the properly hung bear box, or some other large animal simply passing through and curious about the unfamiliar shapes of their camp. That explanation held for exactly as long as it took to look down at the ground around the tent itself. There were footprints there, distinct in the soft, dew-damp mud, circling the entire perimeter of the tent in a loose but unmistakable ring. And every single one of them, all the way around, faced inward, toward the tent, toward where they'd been lying awake the whole night listening, with not a single print anywhere leading back out toward the tree line, toward the creek, toward anywhere at all. They stood over those prints a long time that morning, both of them crouched at different points around the ring, trying to make the pattern mean something less unsettling than what it actually looked like. No animal circles a tent all the way around and leaves without a single track heading away again. No person does either, not without at some point crossing their own path in a way that would show a normal, tangled mess of overlapping footprints, rather than this clean, deliberate loop. They talked it through over breakfast, the way they talked through most things, methodically, trying to land on an explanation that would let them relax enough to enjoy the last full day of the trip. They had one more night scheduled at that same site before the final short hike out the next morning, and neither of them wanted to be the first to suggest packing out early, cutting the loop short over what could, they both kept insisting, still turn out to be some perfectly ordinary wildlife encounter they simply weren't equipped to fully interpret. They decided to stay. It felt, in the daylight, like the more reasonable choice. Better to finish the planned route than backtrack unnecessarily over a night of strange but ultimately harmless noise. And besides, the creek had already gone quiet twice without anything actually happening to them. Whatever had circled the tent had circled it and left. Hadn't torn into their food, hadn't touched their gear, hadn't done anything except walk a slow, patient loop around the canvas walls and disappear again by morning. That decision felt sound enough in daylight. It felt considerably less sound once the sun started going down again. The creek's first silence that second night came earlier than the night before, not long after they'd finished dinner and settled by the fire, rather than retreating straight to the tent. This time, they were both awake and alert for it, and both of them heard the circling begin almost immediately, once the water noise dropped away, closer to the firelight than it had been the previous night, close enough that they caught once or twice the faint suggestion of movement at the very edge of where the fire's glow gave out into full dark. It had a pace to it now that they hadn't fully registered the first time. Slow, unhurried, entirely without the frantic, startled energy of a spooked animal, or the cautious testing movement of something genuinely uncertain about approaching a campsite. It moved like something that already knew exactly what it was doing, tracing the same loop over and over with the patient confidence of routine. They reread the trailhead register note again that evening, pulling up the photo one of them had taken of the page before the trip, and it read differently now than it had 3 days earlier, when they'd laughed about it over lunch at the trailhead. Site 4 gets loud at night. Don't feed it curiosity. It occurred to the husband, sitting there by the dying fire, that he'd shown his headlamp directly toward the circling sound the night before. Once, briefly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. He hadn't mentioned it to his wife until now. They had no cell signal at that site at all. Hadn't since they'd started the loop 3 days earlier, by design as much as by geography. It was part of what made the trip feel worth doing, the genuine disconnection of it. The nearest ranger station was a full day's hike back out the way they'd come, and the trail itself required crossing that same unpredictable creek twice more before it reached anywhere close to help. It was examining the footprints again in the day's last light, comparing them more carefully than they had that morning, that the twist surfaced, quiet and unwelcome between them. The prints circling the tent were consistent. Both of them realized slowly, working it out together. Same size, same stride length, same subtle asymmetry in the left foot's landing, with only one of their own feet. Neither of them had left the tent the night before. Both of them were certain of that. Certain enough that they'd have noticed. Certain enough that they'd already asked each other directly, gently, the way you ask a question you're afraid of the answer to, and gotten the same firm no back both times. That was the detail neither of them wanted to say out loud first. That whatever had circled the tent all night, leaving prints that matched one of their own feet exactly, hadn't been an animal at all, and hadn't, as far as either of them could account for, actually been either one of them either. They didn't sleep much before dark that final night, both of them too aware now of what the fire's failing light would eventually give way to, too aware of the creek's coming silence and what it would let through once it arrived. They talked it over one more time, quietly, practically, the way you plan for a storm you can already see coming. They agreed, without much debate, that whatever happened, they weren't unzipping the tent. Not for a sound, not for anything. Not until real daylight came back and made the decision safe again. The creek went quiet a little after 11 that night, earlier again than the previous nights, and the circling started almost immediately after, closer now than either of the 2 nights before, close enough that they could hear individual footfalls in the leaf litter, rather than a vague, distant impression of movement. It moved at the same unhurried pace, tracing what felt, from inside the tent, like a tightening loop, each pass drawing marginally nearer to the thin nylon walls separating them from whatever was out there. Then, without warning, something brushed against the outside of the tent wall, low, near where the husband was lying. A slow, deliberate pressure moving along the fabric in a shape that neither of them wanted to name out loud, but that both of them, lying frozen in the dark, understood immediately for exactly what it was. A hand, pressed flat against the nylon, fingers spread, moving slowly across the surface the way you'd feel along a wall, in the dark, looking for a door. The circling sound stopped directly behind the tent after that, replaced by a long, complete silence that stretched out far longer than either of them could comfortably measure. They lay perfectly still, holding on to each other in the dark, neither one breathing louder than absolutely necessary, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was a voice, soft, familiar, the wife's own voice, coming from just outside the tent, calling the husband's name, gentle and slightly worried, the exact tone she used when she woke in the night needing him, asking quietly to be let in. He knew with total certainty that his wife was lying right beside him, her hand gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks, her own breath held tight and controlled against his shoulder. He knew the voice outside wasn't hers. He knew it with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with something deeper, some instinct that recognized, even through the careful, near-perfect mimicry, that the rhythm of it was subtly, unmistakably wrong, a fraction too smooth, too patient, missing some small human imperfection his wife's real voice had always carried without either of them ever consciously noticing it until its absence made itself known. They didn't unzip the tent. They didn't answer. They held on to each other in complete silence while that voice called the husband's name 3 more times, each repetition a little quieter, a little more distant, as though it were slowly giving up or slowly moving away, or both, until eventually there was nothing left outside but ordinary night sound again. And then, sometime much later, the creak finally returned, rushing steady and loud and entirely normal, as if it had simply been waiting its turn to speak again. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. They lay awake together until real gray light started coming through the tent fabric, and only then did they finally unzip it, stepping out into a clearing that looked, in daylight, exactly as ordinary and undisturbed as it had every other morning on that loop. The footprints were gone. Not faded, not blurred by dew the way tracks naturally soften overnight. Gone entirely. No trace anywhere in mud that hadn't had nearly enough time to dry smooth again on its own, as if whatever had left them the 2 previous mornings had simply reached down at some point in the night and erased its own evidence before leaving for good. They hiked out that final day faster than planned, saying little to each other, and it was at the trailhead, checking back in and mentioning the strange trip almost as an afterthought to a ranger doing routine register checks, that they got the response that stayed with them longest. The ranger didn't look surprised. Didn't ask many follow-up questions, just nodded slowly and said, almost offhand, that Site 4's register warnings tended to get updated more than people realized, and left it at that. They've never camped that loop again, and neither of them, since that trip, has ever unzipped a tent at night again without listening first, carefully, no matter how familiar the voice outside might sound. The final account is the one people in that county still do not like to discuss, from a family who owned the same land for 3 generations before selling it without explanation. Listen, a woman clearing out her family's homestead after her mother's death says the porch creaked exactly twice, every single time, at hours with no pattern she could find, and that a note in her mother's own handwriting, tucked in a kitchen drawer, warned her never to cross the back fence line once it did. The land had been in her family since her great-grandfather's time. She finished the sale. She has never gone back. She has passed her mother's note on to her own child now without explanation, exactly the way it was given to her. Her mother had passed that winter after a long illness both of them had known was coming for months, the kind of ending that gives you time to prepare and somehow doesn't make the actual moment feel prepared for at all. The homestead sat back in a hollow off an old coal road, land that had belonged to her family since her great-grandfather cleared it and built the first version of the house that stood there now, added onto and repaired and rebuilt in pieces over 4 generations until it had become something more like a living record of the family than simply a place they lived. She'd driven out alone on a Sunday afternoon, planning to spend the week going through her mother's belongings, preparing the house for the sale that had already been discussed and mostly agreed upon among the handful of family members who still had any stake in the decision. Nobody else wanted to take on the land, not with careers and families scattered across 3 different states now, and she'd volunteered for the task the way she volunteered for most difficult things, quietly, without much fuss, because someone needed to and she'd rather it be her than watch strangers do it. The house welcomed her the way it always had, familiar in every creak and smell, despite standing empty for the 2 months since the funeral. She spent that first afternoon airing out rooms that had been closed up all winter, opening windows to let the stale air out, sorting through kitchen drawers full of the accumulated small necessities of a life fully lived in one place for decades. It was in one of those drawers, tucked beneath a stack of expired coupons and old receipts, that she found the note. It was in her mother's handwriting, unmistakable even in its brevity, a single line on a torn scrap of paper that had clearly been kept close at hand for a long time, judging by its worn, softened edges. Don't go past the fence line after the porch creaks twice. She sat with that note a long moment, turning it over in her hands, trying to place it within any memory she had of growing up on that land. She remembered vaguely a family rule about the back fence, something about not wandering past it after dark, the kind of childhood boundary that gets absorbed without ever really being questioned, filed away alongside other unremarkable instructions like don't play near the well or come in before the streetlights come on. She hadn't thought about it in years. She certainly hadn't thought about the porch as being connected to it at all. She lit the wood stove that first evening, the same one her mother had used her entire life. The same one, she realized with a small pang, her great-grandmother had likely used in some earlier iteration of that exact spot in the kitchen. The smoke smell filled the house slowly, familiar and grounding, and for a while, sitting there with a cup of tea and a box of old photographs she'd pulled down from a closet shelf, the whole visit felt less like a difficult task, and more like a quiet, private kind of grieving she hadn't quite had room for yet. The porch creaked around 9 that night. She noticed it the way you notice any house sound in a place you know intimately, filing it automatically under the ordinary category of things that old houses simply do. The porch had always creaked, for as long as she could remember a particular uneven groan whenever the board settled with the temperature drop of evening. It creaked again, almost immediately after, a second distinct sound following close on the first, and then went completely silent. She sat very still for a moment, cup halfway to her mouth, some part of her already reaching for the memory of her mother's note without consciously deciding to. The house had always creaked. It had never creaked in twos before, not that she remembered, not with that particular deliberate spacing, one sound and then a second right behind it, and then nothing at all. She told herself it was simply the temperature, the specific way that particular evenings' cooling air was settling into old boards that had heard every kind of weather this hollow could produce over 3 generations. It was a reasonable explanation. It didn't stop her from getting up and checking the porch through the front window, seeing nothing there but the empty, ordinary dark of the yard beyond it. The tree line, a black shape against a slightly less black sky. The double creak came again later that night, past midnight this time, at an hour with no obvious connection to the first. No shared temperature or wind condition she could identify that would explain the same pattern repeating at a completely different point in the night's natural cooling cycle. Always exactly 2, never 1, never 3. Regardless, it seemed, of anything the weather outside was actually doing. The house had always creaked. It had never creaked in 2s before, not that she remembered. She didn't sleep well that first night, lying awake in her childhood bedroom, listening for it to come again. And somewhere in the exhausted small hours before dawn, she found herself thinking about that note in the kitchen drawer more seriously than she had the moment she'd first read it, wondering, for the first time, exactly what her mother had actually known. She spent the next 2 days working through the house at a steady pace, sorting decades of belongings into the same 3 piles everyone ends up with in situations like this. Keep, donate, decide later. And each evening, without fail, the porch creaked its 2 creaks at some hour that refused to settle into a predictable pattern. Sometimes early, sometimes well past midnight. Always exactly twice. Always followed by a silence that felt, the more nights she sat with it, less like the absence of sound and more like something actively holding still. It was on the second evening, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, that she first noticed the figure at the family cemetery plot. The plot sat at the edge of the property, a small fenced square of ground where 5 generations of her family were buried. Close enough to the house to be visible from several windows, but far enough that details were hard to make out except in good light. There was someone standing there near the old headstones, facing the house directly, motionless in a way that made her stomach drop the instant she registered it wasn't one of the deer that sometimes wandered through at dusk. She watched for a long moment, telling herself it was probably a neighbor, though she couldn't think of anyone who'd have reason to be standing at her family's cemetery at that hour, or a trick of the fading light playing games with a fence post or a low shrub she was misreading in the dimness. The figure didn't move. It stood there, facing the house, for as long as she watched, and eventually she made herself step back from the window and finish the dishes instead, unwilling to keep looking at something that refused to explain itself. She called her aunt that evening, using the weak signal that only held near the old coal road at the edge of the property, hoping for context, for family history, for anything that might make the last 2 days feel less like the beginning of something she didn't understand. She asked about the fence line first, about the note she'd found, careful to keep her voice light, casual, the way you ask a question you're afraid might get a real answer. Her aunt went quiet on the line for a long moment. "Your mother never told you about that," she said eventually, her voice lower than usual, careful in a way that made clear she was choosing her words with real deliberation. "Your great-grandfather kept to the same rule. Said not to go past the fence after the porch went twice. Nobody in this family's ever said exactly why, as long as I've been alive. It's just something we don't do." She pressed a little, gently, asking if anything had ever actually happened, if there was a story behind it that had simply never been passed down properly. Her aunt was quiet again, longer this time, and when she finally spoke, her voice had shifted into something that sounded almost like relief at being asked directly, even as the answer itself gave away very little. There's a figure some of us have seen out by the plot over the years. Different generations, all of us, at different ages. It never comes any closer than the fence. Your mother saw it. I saw it once when I was younger than you are now. We just don't talk about it much because there's nothing much to say. It doesn't do anything. It just stands there. She didn't mention that she'd already seen it herself, standing at that kitchen window. And something about her aunt's easy, matter-of-fact tone, the total absence of alarm in it, unsettled her more than outright fear would have. This wasn't news to anyone in her family. It had simply never been spoken about directly, passed down instead as an unexplained rule attached to an unexplained warning. Generation after generation, without anyone apparently ever needing or wanting to know more than that. She went through the old photo albums again that night, differently this time, looking specifically at any image that included a view of the cemetery plot or the tree line behind it. She found it in more than she expected. Faint, half-obscured shapes near the fence line in photographs spanning decades, family gatherings and holiday visits and ordinary summer afternoons, always dismissed in family memory, she now understood as a photography flaw, a smudge on the lens, nothing worth a second look. It wasn't in every photo, it was in enough of them. She sat with that stack of photographs a long time, the porch silent for once that particular evening, and found herself thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after 2 days of low-grade dread, that whatever this was, it had never actually harmed anyone in her family across 4 generations of living beside it. That thought should have made the rest of the week easier. It didn't, not entirely, but it gave her something steadier to hold on to than fear alone, and she would need that before the week was through. The paperwork for the sale was due to be finalized the next morning, and she spent that final full day moving through the last of the house's rooms with a different kind of urgency than the days before. Less about grief now and more about simply finishing, closing this chapter properly, before she had to hand the keys over to a stranger who'd never know any of what this land actually held. She found herself, that final evening, sitting out on the porch itself rather than inside by the fire. A decision she made almost without deciding it, some part of her understanding that she wanted, before she left this place for good, to face whatever came directly, instead of hearing it filtered through walls and windows the way she had every night before. The evening settled slowly around her, the hollow going from gold to gray to full dark the way it always had. The tree line beyond the cemetery plot losing its edges bit by bit until it was just a darker shape against a dark sky. She sat there with a mug of tea, long gone cold, listening to the ordinary sounds of the property settling into night. And it was well past 10 when the porch board beneath her creaked, once, and then, a beat later, again. She was sitting directly on it this time, feeling the give of the old wood under her own weight as it happened, and there was no explaining it away as distant house settling now, no comfortable remove of hearing it from another room. It had creaked exactly the way it always creaked, twice, evenly spaced, and she was sitting right on top of it when it did. She looked toward the cemetery plot immediately, and the figure was there, as it had been every evening since she'd first noticed it, standing at its usual spot facing the house. But something was different this time, and it took her a moment, heart already hammering, to understand what. It was moving, not standing still the way her aunt had described, the way it apparently always had for 4 generations of her family, watching from a safe, respectful distance. It was walking, slow and deliberate, toward the fence line at the edge of the plot, closing the distance between itself and the boundary it had apparently never once crossed in living memory. She didn't call out. She didn't move from the porch at first, frozen there watching it approach the fence with the same unhurried, patient pace she recognized now from every account woven through this whole strange, unspoken family history. The pacing upstairs, the circling in the woods, the footsteps that stopped when you held your breath. It was the same patience. It had always been the same patience, she understood now. Sitting there on a creaking porch board with her heart in her throat, watching it come. It reached the fence and stopped there, exactly at the boundary, unmoving, as though it had never actually intended to cross it at all, as though the approach itself had simply been something it needed her to see, one time, before she left this land for good. She stood up slowly, backed toward the door without turning her back on it fully, and went inside, closing the door gently behind her at the exact moment, she would say later, that the figure reached the fence and went still. She locked the door, though the house had never needed locking any more than the cabin in that other family's story ever had, and she sat up the rest of that night by the cooling wood stove, listening, waiting for morning. Morning came ordinary and quiet, the hollow bright and green and utterly unremarkable in the way mornings always are after a long night of something that refuses to fully explain itself. She walked out to the fence line before she left, made herself do it, needing to see it once in daylight before she handed this place over to someone else entirely. The bottom rail of the fence, old and sagging, untouched by any repair in years by the look of it, had a handprint pressed into the weathered wood. Fresh, deep enough to have required real pressure, from the outside, facing in toward the house, matching no hand she could account for belonging to anyone who'd been on that property in longer than she cared to think about. The sale went through that afternoon. She signed the papers at a lawyer's office 2 towns over and drove away from that hollow without looking back at the house in her mirror, the way she realized later. So many people in these stories seemed to end up driving away from places that had asked something of them they couldn't fully name. Months later, a cousin who still lived close enough to check on the vacant property mentioned, almost offhand, in the kind of casual family catch-up call that covers a dozen unrelated topics before it ends, that the porch still creaked twice sometimes, even with no one living there, even with nobody around to hear it at all. She kept her mother's note. She has never gone back to see the property since, not even once, not even out of curiosity when the new owners, she heard, rebuilt the back fence in the exact same place it had always stood. The same way, she would later learn, every subsequent owner after that rebuilt it too, in that same spot, for reasons none of them could quite articulate either. She has passed the note on to her own child now, the same handwriting, 1 generation removed, the same brief, unexplained warning about a fence line and a porch that creaks in twos. She didn't add anything to it. She didn't feel she needed to, and some part of her suspects that adding anything at all would only take away from whatever it was actually protecting against. Somewhere in that hollow tonight, in a house nobody lives in anymore, a porch board is creaking. Twice. And then it goes quiet the way it always has, waiting the way it always will for whoever comes back to listen next.